welcome to the Consent Corner podcast. My name is Ellie.
I'm Addie.
And my name's Anna.
Today in this episode, we will talk about some very sensitive subjects, such as human trafficking, and we will focus on labor and sex trafficking.
So, Anna, could you talk a little bit about the types of labor trafficking?
Of course. So there are two types, bonded labor and involuntary servitude. So in bonded labor, the victim owes a debt, and so their release is contingent on the payment of that debt. But oftentimes they won't know how much debt they owe, and it will continue, and they won't know when they're done, and they won't know how many more times they have to continue their labor. And with involuntary servitude, it is a lot more obvious and blunt in the way it's being forced. So victims are forced into doing that labor, but they're also being threatened and made to feel as if their loved ones or themselves are at harm if they aren't going to continue.
Yeah, great. So, something that we're also seeing recently is that a lot of people who might have a pending immigration status are being targeted for labor trafficking because, that trafficker can hold it over them, their status. They can be like, hey, if you don't keep working for me, I will call immigration. And, they might frame it as protection, but it's really coercion. And what about survival sex? What's that?
So, survival sex is basically having sexual interactions with other people. If you're in a situation where you need, let's say, maybe you're homeless, you need shelter, you need food, you need money, like stuff like that, stuff you need to survive, like shelter and food. And that's why it's called survival sex, because then you will do sexual acts or like have sexual intercourse with another person for those necessities in life. And oftentimes that is makes you vulnerable, which we will talk about later. But
And also, sometimes if you engage in survival sex with someone who is doing that for survival, you can be faced with the sex offender charge.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So something interesting too is you started talking about vulnerability. So how might someone be vulnerable to sex trafficking?
Well, to sex trafficking, um, somebody, it's like a lot of times it starts with grooming. It doesn't have to, but a lot of times it does. And groomers often look for someone who's vulnerable. And vulnerable can mean many things for many different people, but when we say vulnerable, like oftentimes we're talking about being in a position where you might have gone through abuse, you might be homeless, like bad financial position, which is also like survival sex. Like, you do it because you need these things to survive. And so it's just like being in those positions, people who have a lot of trauma in their past and stuff like that. Groomers will see that because they're good at what they do. So they'll see that in a very like evil way, and they'll be like, oh, this person's vulnerable, and take advantage of them and start like grooming them, which can lead to sex trafficking.
And through that, groomers will gain trust and also information. And by doing that, they'll start to like isolate the person being groomed from their friends and family and maintain a belief that the groomer is the only person they can really trust and emotionally available for. So using that isolation, abuse can often begin, and there will be the groomer will maintain like power and control through isolation.
Yeah, good point. So we actually had the opportunity to listen to a survivor story who was groomed. And yeah, it was really interesting to see that process really go through of, just that, spending more time with them, building this, strong, inappropriate but emotional bond. Um, and yeah, like, making them feel like they're special, supported, their opinions are valued. Um, and then at some point, it's kind of a testing of boundaries. Like, what can I do with this child? What will they, let me do? And then eventually, like Abby said, it can become a situation where sexual trafficking is happening.
Yeah, kind of like an example we heard often for grooming is like putting a lobster in boiling water. If you put a lobster immediately into a pot of boiling water, it will jump out of the water. Or a frog, like a lobster or frog, the frog will like immediately jump out of the water. But when you put like a frog or lobster in cold water and slowly start to turn up the heat to boil it, it won't even notice what's happening until it's already been boiled and cooked.
It will stay in the water. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
really
that's
interesting.
and yeah, that's just like a point we heard a lot of the time when we were talking about grooming, because it is kind of like that. It's like the groomer isolates you, builds this trust, makes you feel like they're the only one who will be there for you, and then at that point, like, you don't even recognize what's happening to you.
Yeah, and that survivor in particular, she was having difficulties at home, and I think that we saw some similarities with um, the story of an Epstein survivor. And as she was growing up in her early life, there was a lot of family pressure. There was, you have to be well mannered. You must look a certain way. Women and young girls, they have this, certain duty. They need to listen to men. Maybe not as much of a nurturing family environment. Her mom suffered trauma. She grew up around alcohol and substance abuse. And finally, she was also taken advantage of at a young age and sexually exploited by people in her family and close friends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna add like one more thing. Another thing groomers do that leads to sex trafficking is like they fill a need. Um, and this also kind of goes into like this myth, or like it's not a myth because it can happen, but it's often like misconstrued that sex trafficking is just like kidnapping someone and like forcing them to do all this stuff. That can happen, but oftentimes it's more like the person who's trafficking you builds a relationship with you, builds a bond with you, is like to get to know you, isolates you, does all these things, like fills a need for you, and then it slowly becomes sex trafficking. And that can also, like, a book we're reading is Nobody's Girl, um, and Virginia in Nobody's Girl, at that point in her life when she met Epstein, wanted to be a masseuse, and Epstein like promised her, I can make you a masseuse, I can do all these things. And then it became sexual, and she became part of Epstein's sex trafficking ring.
Yeah. Anna, do you want to talk a little bit about what sextortion is and online safety and what that's all about?
Yeah, so a lot of the times in recent years we've seen a big increase in online sex trafficking. So with the new technology such as AI, a lot of adults are grooming children by posing as their peers or younger kids by using AI generated images, for example. And so a lot of the time they will groom those kids, and like a stage of grooming, they will gain trust and information. And with that information, they will gain a lot of that trust that allows them to be like, "Oh, hey, will you send me a sexually explicit photo? Will you do this for me, that?" And it's all safe. There's so much privacy. I would never share it with anyone. And that trust creates an environment where that kid is like, sure, yeah. And they do, and it ends up creating sextortion, which is when someone will blackmail you with that sexually explicit image of you. And oftentimes it can also be an AI generated image that isn't even you. And so in that case scenario, in sextortion, like there's a lot of misconceptions where it's like, oh, like the child knew everything, but it's really all on like the person posing as a child's fault. Like that is a disgusting thing to do. And in cases, a lot of male cases, when someone's being sextorted, um they're being blackmailed for money. So the person posing as a child will be like, I will release this to all your followers or your friends if you don't give me $500. And that will create an environment where the kid doesn't feel like they have any options. And in that scenario, there have been a lot of cases where a child loses their life because they don't think they have any options. And there are options. You can report it to an adult, and the best thing to do is not to give money, because even if they say it's a one-time thing, it will never happen again. It will happen again. They will keep using you and blackmailing you until eventually they get even more. So it's really important to report and not use and not give anything else.
Yeah, and Anna, like you talked about, how it's never the child's fault, it's the person asking, or like the adult's fault, but it's the person asking for these photos, which is completely correct. But like Ellie, do you want to maybe say how you can like prevent this happening, like being in this position to begin with, like with the location and like not sending news and stuff?
Yeah, totally. So there are a lot of privacy things that you can do. And I think that something important to note is that, like she said, there's a common trend with um, male identifying people. There's also a common trend with female identifying. So if someone, is lording a picture, real or AI, over you, they might ask, send me more, give me more. And yeah, to your question, if you want to not, you know, there's no true way to prevent it, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But there are ways that you or your child can, work towards creating a safer online environment. And honestly, I think that a lot of that is up to the people creating technology. But as a child or as a parent, I think that you can do certain things like turning your location off for those specific apps. There are also a lot of ways that you can blur images that are coming in that are sexually explicit. And yeah, I think that it would be a really helpful and healthy conversation to have with your child or your parent on how do I create a safe experience? How do I make sure that the people following me are my friends and not people I don't know posing as people I do know?
Yeah, it's really important. And I think it's actually really important to notice like some of the signs of both. So in the signs of labor trafficking, you can often see very young children in restaurants or like any line of work, and those young children are often doing very abnormal hours. And obviously there are some cases where it's like a family restaurant, or there are many different options, like sometimes it's a teenager, but it's important to notice when it's like a child doing abnormal hours. What's also like a sign is when they are living with their employer or they aren't allowed to leave. So, like, there are security measures prohibiting them from leaving. So, that's really important to know when you're seeing something that you may like notice and be like, huh, that's interesting, that's weird. And oftentimes there's like employers controlling their documents or IDs, and that goes kind of back to immigration and how employers can hold people who have like less documentation, hold that over their head and be like, oh, if you report me, you're gonna go down too.
Yeah. What about sex trafficking?
So, signs of sex trafficking are often poor physical health or physical injury. Obviously, this can be from many things, but it is like one sign if there are other signs happening. Another sign is avoiding eye contact, especially with authority or like people of authority. Not they with sex trafficking, a lot of the time the person who's being trafficked is told by whoever's trafficking them that they should only look in their trafficker's eyes, not in like anyone else's eyes. So avoiding eye contact, scripted or rehearsed responses, that's also a big one, especially if like the person being trafficked is at a hospital or something and the nurse might be asking them or doctor might be asking them questions and they have a scripted response. That's something to look out for. Lacking documents or personal possessions, that's also with kind of intertwines with labor trafficking. So that's just always kind of a big red flag. Frequent absences, another thing. Specific tattoos or branding, that's also a big thing. If someone has like a tattoo that kind of shows that they're property of someone, that's what like the traffickers like to do to their victims, like to like make sure people know it's their like that they're trafficking them in like the sick way of like, oh, they're my property. And then also like sudden changes in possession with no source of income. Like if someone, that's also the trafficker kind of filling the need. If someone needs like um new clothes or something, the trafficker will, kind of buy them this and like groom them to trust them and stuff. And so if someone suddenly shows up with new clothes that you've known they've kind of had a bad financial situation, it's just kind of random, that's another red flag.
Yeah.
And then, like, Ellie, do you want to talk about the resources and help people in these situations can get?
Totally. So one thing that we do know of is in the case of sexploitation, there is Take It Down, which is kind of a movement towards taking down sexually explicit photos that are unconsensual or AI generated. So what this does is that any time that that photo is reposted and found on any sort of site, they use the image's information to try and take it down. A really important way to report human trafficking is the National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-888-373-7888. Yeah.
Thank you so much for watching,
Thank
and
you.
please DM the Instagram if you have Instagram if you have any questions.
Thank you.